Here, and I'm excited to answer our next question. This week's question is from Lizzie from Kansas City. Lizzie asks, Dear dietitians, I was recently diagnosed with Hashimoto's disease, and my doctor told me that I should eat a gluten-free diet. Is this true? Should I really be eating a gluten-free diet because I have Hashimoto's disease? Lizzie, thanks for the question. So I'm really excited to hear first that your doctor did recommend some dietary interventions to help with your condition. It's exciting to hear that medical providers do offer some advice about what to eat to help with certain conditions you may have. Now, that being said, is this information accurate? Do you really need to be eating a gluten-free diet if you have Hashimoto's disease? Okay, so first let's talk about what Hashimoto's disease is. So Hashimoto's disease is a chronic immune disorder where our body has determined that our thyroid cells are a danger to it. So our body starts attacking its own thyroid cells. This decreases the level of T lymphocytes or T cells that we have in our body, and those are important immune cells. With the decrease in the T cells, we have an increase in inflammatory cytokines that are going throughout our whole body. So the condition is characterized by elevated serum levels of anti-thyroid molecules, and the two most common are called anti-TPO and anti-TG molecules. This condition is also characterized by abnormal serum levels of thyroid hormones T3 and T4. So this may mean that they're either too high or too low, depending on what condition you have. An ultrasound of your thyroid is also required for diagnosis, and that would show that we either have an enlarged thyroid or perhaps nodules on the thyroid. It would also show increased fibrosis in your thyroid, which would mean fibrous cells and potentially fatty tissue that could make your thyroid less efficient at producing these hormones. Difficult to diagnose Hashimoto's disease because there are many different symptoms that you could have, and sometimes they kind of wax and wane. Sometimes you'll feel really intense symptoms and sometimes not feel so many. So some of the symptoms of Hashimoto's are reduced heart rate. So that would mean that your heart is beating slower. Swelling of subcutaneous tissues, so things like water retention, swelling in your legs, arms, or face. A B12 deficiency or an iron deficiency, nervous system disorders, constipation, which is due to decreased intestinal motility, chronic fatigue, mood swings, reproductive issues, hair loss, difficulty concentrating, and overall a decreased quality of life, which isn't shocking hearing about all those different symptoms you could have. Hashimoto's is also correlated with other autoimmune diseases. So sometimes when you have one autoimmune disease, it kind of makes your body really ripe for the picking for another autoimmune disease. And a couple of these autoimmune diseases that are commonly diagnosed with Hashimoto's are type 1 diabetes, lymphocytic thyroidosis, and celiac disease. So about 5% of adults with Hashimoto's disease are also diagnosed with celiac disease, and that's compared to about 1% of the general population that has celiac disease. The increase in anti-thyroid molecules in our bloodstream, as well as different vitamin deficiencies, also make patients with Hashimoto's at risk for mood disorders, especially depression and obsessive compulsive disorder. How do you develop Hashimoto's disease? Sometimes it's genetic. It can also be linked to different pharmaceutical drugs and exposure to radiation. It may also be linked to chronic stress, which can cause an increase in cortisol secretion and cause an increase in inflammatory cytokines in the body or chronic inflammation. It can also be linked to diet and lifestyle. So diet is really important in the treatment of Hashimoto's and in the occurrence of Hashimoto's. It could be linked to excessive iodine intake. And in the United States, our table salt is supplemented by iodine. If we don't have enough iodine, then it is a problem and it can cause us to have goiters, which is a big swollen thyroid. But if we have too much iodine, that can also be negative to our thyroid gland. Another nutrient that is really critical in the functionality of our thyroid is selenium. So selenium is a nutritional antioxidant. It's found in foods like Brazil nuts, organ meats, and seafood. So it helps to reduce oxidative stress or chronic inflammation, and it also works as a cofactor with those thyroid hormones to help make them be effective in our body. Selenium is an antioxidant micronutrient, so it helps to reduce oxidative stress in our body, which is also known as chronic inflammation or inflammatory cytokines. So it can help to deactivate or activate specific thyroid hormones working as a cofactor. So this is a really important nutrient as it relates to our thyroid health. That being said, more isn't always better because too much selenium can be toxic to our body. So now let's get straight to the question. Does the gluten-free diet actually help with the symptoms of Hashimoto's? So if you have celiac disease, which we talked about earlier as being common to have with Hashimoto's disease, you do need to follow a gluten-free diet. That's the only treatment method for celiac currently. But what if you don't have celiac disease? Do you still benefit from having a gluten-free diet? So it's not been clearly demonstrated that gluten can stimulate the immune system to produce those antibodies that destroy thyroid tissue, but it is hypothesized. After reading through a lot of different studies, I found that the gluten-free diet after the diagnosis of Hashimoto's disease and soon after the diagnosis of Hashimoto's disease can really help with the prevention of developing other autoimmune conditions like celiac disease. So that sounds kind of funny that, if you stop eating gluten soon after your diagnosis of Hashimoto's disease, you could prevent having celiac disease. Why does that matter? If you are following a gluten-free diet, it would be okay, every once in a while to have something that has gluten in it, and you might have a symptom flare up. But with celiac disease, it's not okay to kind of have those slip ups every once in a while. You could be dealing with some serious issues if that's the case. So like I said earlier, right now there really isn't concrete evidence that a gluten-free diet is beneficial to Hashimoto's patients. One meta-analysis of 4 different randomized controlled trials did show promise for a gluten-free diet in the treatment of Hashimoto's disease. This would be especially important in a patient with gluten-related conditions, which include celiac disease, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or the presence of anti-transglutamase antibodies in the bloodstream without a biopsy of the intestines. So a biopsy of your intestines is required for a true diagnosis of celiac disease because we want to see that gluten is actually damaging your intestinal mucosa and getting rid of those microvilli inside your intestine. A gluten-free diet has been shown to have a general anti-inflammatory effect overall in autoimmune diseases, and it can improve symptoms alongside pharmacological treatment like Synthroid or levothyroxine, which is what you would use to replace thyroid hormones that are low in your body. This was a small meta-analysis of 4 studies, and so the data isn't really robust enough for us to recommend this for everyone, but it is promising. Gluten-free diet can help reduce intestinal permeability in patients with Hashimoto's disease. So all of our intestines are permeable to some extent. If they weren't, then we weren't going to be able to get any of the nutrition coming out from our food. It would just kind of pass through our body. But when our intestines become too permeable, that's when it really becomes a problem, and we need to make some changes. If it becomes too permeable, then larger molecules can escape from our intestinal walls and kind of float around in our body. And when they're in those weird places that they're not supposed to be, our body says, "Ooh, I don't like that," and it starts to attack that molecule. So that's when our body starts to react or flare up to these things that are actually benign just because it's finding it in different places in our body, and that causes an issue. The gluten-free diet can also decrease a mild inflammatory state of the intestines. So reducing the amount of autoimmune triggers in your body can also decrease those amounts of antithyroid molecules that might be attacking your immune system. A gluten-free diet may also help with the absorption and use of selenium, vitamin D, iodine, and zinc, which are all micronutrients that are necessary for thyroid hormone production and for function of our thyroid. Being deficient in these nutrients can increase symptoms of Hashimoto's disease. So, anytime you make a type of diet change where you're eliminating a specific ingredient, it means that you're going to have to be way more mindful in the choices that you're making. And you're going to be needing to read labels and really think about what you're going to have. So, that increased level of mindfulness does need to be noted when you're looking at these studies, because if people are reporting decreased inflammation, weight loss, all sorts of different positive outcomes, it could be because they're just paying more attention to what they're eating overall and being more selective. With those restrictions too, you might have to cook more at home, or you might have to eliminate some of those processed foods, the ultra processed foods that you keep in your home that contain gluten. So keep that in mind as you think about some of these different outcomes. Potentially just making some of those changes, like cooking more at home, being more mindful about what you eat, incorporating more fruits, vegetables, and whole grains into your diet, can make some of these changes. One of the key factors in eliminating inflammation from your body is being at an appropriate weight for your height, because adipose tissue is by nature inflammatory. So if we have too much adipose tissue, it's constantly secreting these inflammatory hormones into our body, which leads to inflammation. So making sure that you're taking in the right amount of calories for your body is one way to reduce inflammation overall. A gluten-free diet can have higher levels of ultra-processed foods that are trying to mimic or dupe traditionally gluten-containing foods. And these foods can be higher in lipids, trans fat, salt, and saturated fat, and they might even have lower levels of protein, fiber, and micronutrients. So just because a food says gluten-free does not necessarily mean that it's healthier. When I discuss a gluten-free diet with clients, I focus on using naturally gluten-free grains and starches rather than finding a dupe for the gluten-containing food. So an example of this would be, I'm going to have rice or quinoa instead of a gluten-free pasta to substitute for that pasta, because if I choose a pasta made out of rice, it's going to be significantly more processed than that rice itself. So there are some foods where you need to find a dupe. For example, bread. If we want to have a gluten-free bread, we've got to find one. But overall, I focus on adding in more naturally gluten-free foods that are free from processing. So now we know that a gluten-free diet may help with symptoms of Hashimoto's disease, but it's not necessarily clinically proven at this point in time. So what should I eat if I have Hashimoto's disease? Again, I talked about maintaining a healthy weight and eating the appropriate amount of calories for what your body needs, because having that excess adipose tissue or fat can secrete more inflammatory cytokines. So maintaining a healthy weight for people with Hashimoto's disease can be more difficult because thyroid hormones control the way that our body processes energy or food. So this condition typically means that our metabolism is lower, but not always. It can also mean that we're struggling with fatigue or mood swings, brain fog, and a lot of times those kind of feelings make me reach for something sweet or with really simple carbohydrates so I can just get some quick energy. And I think that that's pretty common for people with Hashimoto's disease to feel. So some of the best results and improvements to our thyroid hormones came from a study where patients were eating a diet of 1,400 to 1,600 calories per day based on their weight, and they were eating macronutrient ratios of 25% protein, 30% fat, and 45% carbohydrate. So that still is a pretty low carbohydrate diet, but you can see that those are balanced macronutrients. And if you want to know more about macronutrients, you can check out my last video. So the diet that we are eating, we want to be rich in antioxidants like vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, polyphenols, which are specific molecules that are only found in plant foods that provide different benefits in our body. We want omega-3 fatty acids, monounsaturated fatty acids, and polyunsaturated fatty acids. And we want to have plenty of zinc, iron, folic acid, B12, and magnesium. Iodine and selenium, like we talked about earlier, are definitely important for the function and synthesis of thyroid hormones. So you'll want to have those in your diet as appropriate. One of the most easy foods to get selenium into your diet is to add 2 or 3 Brazil nuts per day. They're very high in selenium. And these levels kind of vary between different foods because they come from the soil, and the quality of the soil that your food is grown in makes a difference in how much selenium is contained in it. Another study showed positive effects from supplementing 4,000 IUs of vitamin D each day, 2,000 micrograms of selenomethionine, and 30 milligrams of zinc gluconate per day. Another supplement that has shown benefits for people with hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's disease is black cumin seed oil, also known as Nigella sativa. Talked a lot about chronic inflammation and inflammatory cytokines, and I just want to be clear that the diet that we're looking at for Hashimoto's disease should be an anti-inflammatory diet. But an anti-inflammatory diet is kind of different for each person because something that could inflame my body, for example, lactose, if I'm lactose intolerant, might work really well for someone who doesn't have lactose intolerance. So this is going to take a little bit of knowing yourself and experimenting with your body. I always like to tell my patients that they are the expert on themselves. You know the most about your body and how things feel. So I'm here to help guide you to find different options, but in the end, it's going to be you who makes that final decision. This diet should be rich in leafy greens, vegetables, lean parts of meat and poultry, and whole grains that are unprocessed. So pretty much standard across the board. This is the diet that we're looking at. The Mediterranean diet has been one of the most well-studied diets in the history of different diets, and it is known as an anti-inflammatory diet. It really focuses on a lot of plant foods, legumes, seeds, healthy sources of fat, lean proteins, and low-fat dairy products in moderation. Again, overall, I'm going to sound like a broken record. Just because something works for someone else doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for you. So something that I would encourage you to do if you're struggling with Hashimoto's disease is use yourself as a little bit of an experiment. Start with keeping a detailed food journal. So in your journal, you could write down how much of each food that you're eating, either weighing it out with a food scale, using your hands to measure different quantities, or measuring cups and spoons, or you can just write down what you're having. And then I also would want you to journal a little bit about what your symptoms are. So sometimes, we'll say, oh, I felt really brain fog and tired and achy this particular day, but I can't remember what I ate. So if we're writing that information down, it's going to be really helpful to you yourself and to any of your providers that might be helping you determine what kind of issues you're having. So that's the first step. The second step is that I want you to kind of make these little changes one at a time and see if you notice any difference. The changes with Hashimoto's might be very, very small. So potentially an example would be adding vitamin D supplementation. You may or may not see and feel a huge difference from that, but if you're not noticing any negative side effects, you could think, well, maybe this is helpful. And if it's not too inconvenient for you, that's something that I would recommend continuing. And then we would add on another habit, like maybe I cook dinner at home 3 times a week, and on those nights I work on having gluten-free foods. Journal about how you feel on those days and what specific symptoms that you might have. So again, the more data that you have, the better recommendations that we can make for you. So to wrap everything up, with this research, a gluten-free diet may be something that's helpful for the treatment of symptoms in Hashimoto's disease, but it hasn't necessarily been clinically proven yet. All of the studies that I looked at are really recent, so I think that this is going to become a big area of research, as it is something that affects a lot of people, especially women. So it's something that I'm definitely interested in seeing what the research says in the future. Thank you guys so much for your questions. It was so great to see you, and I can't wait to get your next one. Bye.